Well, it's that time of the week again. It's time for Chit Chat Across the Pond. This is episode number 805 for January 10th, 2025, and I'm your host, Allison Sheridan. I have become a major fangirl of Dr. Andrea Jones-Roy. They're a data scientist and a stand-up comedian and a circus performer. I mean, how could they not be fun, right? Andrea is a professor at the New York University Center for Data Science, and in that capacity, they created a 20-part video series called Data Science for Everyone. Now, they're not kidding. This is the best part. The video series is free. I thought, hey, I'll give it a try. I ended up watching all 20 episodes of this video series, and I loved every single minute of it. And Andrea also includes a free online written textbook, but I am going to confess I did not read that book yet. And I didn't do any of the homework that they told us to. Anyway, with that, welcome to the show from your favorite teacher's pet, Andrea.
Hi, it's so nice to finally meet my favorite teacher's pet. I can't tell you how scarce pets are these days. So this is very exciting to be here. And I think you win the prize. I'm not sure anyone has watched all of them besides you. So
I did feel
correct
good.
me if I'm wrong, listeners. But
one of them you did say, you said, I don't think anybody's still listening. I mean, who would still be watching this?
I mean, the idea originally with these, so it's not the full course. The idea was, I'm going to do highlights of the key concepts so that like students can refer to it. And I think they're important parts of maybe other people taking with an interest in data, whatever. But then as I went, I was like, it's really hard to just pull out highlights without explaining everything. So I must have said that on minute 20 of what was supposed to be a 4-minute video or something like that. So is anyone out here?
They're not terribly long though. I mean, they're like 20 minutes, 25 minutes, something like that. They're bite-sized.
Yeah.
I crammed through them in like 3 or 4 days. I'm really enjoyed it. Yeah, I loved it.
Well, thank you for watching. I actually have a few more that I never published, but I think they're more like wrap-up sort of thing. So if you if after a while, yeah, just sort of end. You're just like, then goodbye. No, there is something of a goodbye that I need to post the final season, I think,
to be able to tell that we're done. Well,
yes.
let's start in the middle of this. There's so many things I want to ask you about, but let's start in the middle with. So, what is a data scientist?
So a data scientist, if you ask anyone, they'll probably tell you like 200 different answers. Like, I don't even think a data scientist has a concrete definition of a data scientist, but my version of a data scientist is someone who uses data and science to make discoveries about the world. And you might be asking yourself, isn't that just regular science, Andrea? And the answer is kind of, yes. And I prefer a more inclusive definition than a more specific one. But usually in data science, the way that we're using data, it's through computation or computationally intensive methods like machine learning or other algorithms or AI or whatever kind of technology is of interest to you. And so you're using computation and statistics in clever ways to learn more from data than perhaps you might if you were just doing, like a mean and a couple of scatter plots. That said, I think you can learn a ton about the world from means and scatter plots. And I think in the excitement about machine learning and all this other stuff, we've forgotten that you can learn a ton from very simple methods too. So that's part of why I'm so broad about data science. Like if you're using data and you're being scientific, I call you a data scientist.
I loved at the very beginning. I was yelling at my iPad saying, "Oh, you know what would be great, Andrea, is if you knew about that site that correlates things like the amount of cheese in Wisconsin to earthquakes in Zimbabwe, and the next lesson you put it out there to explain correlation."
Yes, Tyler, I don't know how to say his name, Tyler or her name or their name, tylervigen.com, VIGEN. Is the site. It's amazing. It's generated
priceless.
Some people have friends and hobbies. I just sit and click generate on the spurious. If you Google spurious correlations, I think you'll pretty much get to it. But it's like divorce rates in Norway correlate with droughts in Kentucky. Whatever. It's amazing. It's beautiful.
Yeah. There's usually a movies released by can't remember his name.
Nicolas Cage.
Yeah. Nicolas Cage movies correlated against other things are great. So
yes. He correlates with a lot, it turns out. I think if I ever become a conspiracy theorist, it's going to be full on Nick Cage related conspiracies. You heard it here first.
So you mentioned the idea of using data and science. And like you said, I mean, to me, that's what science is science uses data.
That's right.
And people who make decisions that aren't based on data, that bothers me. I'm all about data. But you also get into talking about, using data where you can't do an experiment to create the data. So I'm used to, okay, I developed this theory. Let's say I'm an astronomer, and I'm going to be doing, I've not the experimental side. I'm the other side that I can never remember the name of. But you create
theoretical side.
Theoretical. Thank you. So I've developed this great theory, and then I need to be able to create a test to see whether that theory is true. And so I need to collect data and figure out whether it maps into that.
Right.
Well, astronomy is probably a bad example because you can't create that either. But
in like the Large Hadron Collider and other experiments that you do locally as in on Earth, in massive locations to test theories about physics. Because you're exactly right. You're even in astronomy, you're limited to what's called observational data, as opposed to lots of scientists where in medicine, for example, you get to run experiments, and that's like the gold standard for inference.
You go measure things on a mouse, poor mousey, and you do these experiments and figure out what works and what doesn't, and develop theories and test again and that sort of thing. But in the fields where you do data science, you don't get to start there. You have to start with data that exists, because I think one of the examples you gave was if you wanted to see whether cigarette smoking causes cancer, you can't take half the group and say, okay, you have to smoke, because apparently there's issues with that.
I mean, it sounds fun to me, and but I just couldn't get it past the ethics board at my university. So maybe in the days of Don Draper, they could do cigarette studies with experience. But that's exactly it. Is the distinction in. So my background is in political science, and so I do a lot of research about political phenomena. So how are people going to vote? That might be on a few people's minds these days. Or how did people vote? Why did they vote the way that they did? Or even things like wars and what kind of regimes lead to economic prosperity, or what kind of, democracy versus autocracy, is that better for the health of the citizens? You can't randomly assign democracy to some countries or randomly assign a civil war and see what happens, right?
Right.
I mean, in some ways you can kind of mess with the system a little bit if you're, and now I'm becoming conspiratorial again. I think you have to believe in a deep state to be like, actually, you could run an experiment on us. But generally speaking, the things I'm interested in, we don't get to run the most recent US presidential election again under a different treatment. What if we had more carefully, what if Kamala Harris had gone on the Joe Rogan podcast? What if the economy, she had messaged differently about the economy? And a lot of people have arguments that say, yeah, then she would have won if she did this or she did that. The only way to really tell scientifically is to literally run the universe a second time with this one thing changed. Just like in a drug trial or these poor mice, right? It's like, I'm going to give, everything is the same between these two mice, except one gets the drug and one doesn't. And we see if they get better, right?
And you only change one thing at a time. That's controlled experiments, but you can't do that.
You cannot do that, both for ethical reasons in the case of civil war and assigning people to smoke, and for practical logistical reasons. We can't run 10,000 elections in the United States all at the same time. It's just, until time travel is invented, we can't do it. And so what you're working with then is observational data. And what observational data means is you have to be a lot more cautious when you try to learn things about that data, particularly as it pertains to causality. So the reason we do randomized controlled trials is that those are the closest we can get to causality. So if I think A causes B, I need to run two sets of the world where the only thing that changes is the presence of A in one and not in the other. And if A causes B, when A is there, we'll see B. And when A is not there, we won't see B. And even then, you probably want to do it a bunch more times with other variations just to make sure that it's not some C, D, or E or whatever. But you really can't do that for most data that we're interested in. And so that means you're looking at data that already exists. And that means you have to think very carefully about what you can learn from this data and be very transparent about what you cannot learn. And so that means websites like this spurious correlations one are so instructive, because you can find correlations between all kinds of different things that may have no causal relationship whatsoever. So for example, the Nick Cage movies tend to correlate with people drowning in swimming pools.
Right.
And probably it's not the case that Nick Cage is causing people to drown in swimming pools. We could kind of make a story. I usually like to make my students, it's a bit dark, tell a story. Like, why might it, what if it were a causal relationship? It's like, well, we really don't like the movies, so we kill ourselves. Like, it's horrible, right? Or you're so entranced by the movie that you just fall into a pool. Like, it's difficult. But the correlation is really, really strong. And so that's just one of many ways that we need to think about data, not just run the analyses and then infer whatever we want. So because we're working, as you can see, I talk about this forever, when we're working with observational data, there's a lot more kind of like careful reasoning and thought that needs to go into the conclusions we draw because we can't control what generated the data in the first place.
That sounds
There
really
are
hard.
some cool things.
Drawing
It's really
the
hard.
scatter plots is fun, though.
It's very fun. The other thing I'll say is the line correlation does not imply causation is important. It's the first thing we all learn in statistics, or one of the first things, but it's also important to remember that it doesn't not imply causation. So if you're saying, I think there's a correlation between, let's just keep going with Nick Cage and pools. If I think there's a correlation between Nick Cage movies coming out and people drowning in the pool, and I think that correlation is meaningful, it could be. Just because it's a correlation doesn't mean it's not meaningful. There could be a causal relationship there. It just means we can't say for sure. So a lot of times the best we have is correlation. So here's a more concrete example with cigarettes. It took forever for the United States government to pass laws to either put labels on cigarettes about how dangerous they were, to limit the marketing of cigarettes to children, to not advertise them near school, all those things that we, ban smoking indoors, all those things, because the cigarette lobby, the tobacco lobby said correlation does not imply causation. And because we can't do a randomized controlled trial and randomly assign 20 people to smoke for 50 years and see what happens to them, because we think it might it might cause something bad, we only have observational data. We only have correlations. And we have to do our best with that and say, look, we've looked at it every which way. Even though the best we've got is a correlation, that doesn't mean there's not causation. And we've checked for all these other things. Because you could say, well, if correlation does not imply causation, then why else might people who smoke a lot be more likely to get lung cancer? And maybe you make an argument that it has to do with where they're living and it's some other environmental factor, or maybe it's a level of stress that's causing both. You have to turn over all those rocks to make your case, but sometimes correlation is the best that you have.
Well, and of course, the government should still continue to subsidize tobacco growing.
Oh, yeah, of course. That's the key. Yeah. Exactly right. Yes.
It's a key.
I mean, the real challenge, now you've got me on my high horse, the real challenge with data and with science is that data and data science are both very much about uncertainty and about being like, yeah, we could be wrong. We've done 2,000 studies tracking smokers and non-smokers and their health outcomes. But as true scientists, we need to be completely transparent that the next study we do could suddenly reveal that it's actually super healthy for you. That's very, very unlikely. But truly good science is one that says, yeah, we just don't know for sure because the world, we maybe just haven't studied it the right way. That little sliver, unfortunately, is where tobacco companies and lobbyists, and we see the same with climate change, we see the same with vaccines. You can exploit the inherent uncertainty in science to cast doubt on all of it, even though it is pretty convincing. And the uncertainty is part of what makes us scientists, is admitting we can't know everything, right?
I love that point because obviously we saw that with vaccines and masks and everything, is that the anti-science people would say, oh, look, you said we had to do this, and now you're saying we have to do that.
Yes.
And you don't really know, so science is all BS. And I have a great example, and it kind of folds in. You and I were talking beforehand about playing around with AI like ChatGPT and asking it questions and when it makes up answers. My favorite example about that, and it gets back to this point, is I asked it, the first thing I ever asked ChatGPT was, tell me about the moons of Mars. And it's
cool.
Phobos and Deimos. And outspit this beautiful article that was like, it was written out of Sky and Telescope magazine. I mean, it was articulate. It was fascinating. It was really good. And one of the lines in there said, unlike all of the other planets in our solar system, the moons rotate in the opposite direction. And I thought, now I'm no astronomer, but I think I would have heard about that. And there'd be some real physics questions in there. Like, let me go double check this. And I look, and it's of course false. That isn't what happens.
Wow.
However, imagine that you're an astronomer and you're living on Mars. And you look up in the sky and you see the two moons rise in the west and you see them set in the east. Mm-hmm. You would draw that conclusion, right? That is a scientific observation. You can prove it. You can see it. You write it down. It's in the scrolls, and you do it. And then you get space flight. You go out and you look at the planet, and you discover that Mars is rotating, or the moons are rotating so slowly that they're slower than the rotation of the planet, which makes it look like Well, they actually do rise in the west and set in the east, but it makes it look like they're rotating the wrong direction. So that's a case of where new scientific evidence disproves something that was incontrovertible when you could only stand on the planet. And I love that example as exactly what you were talking about.
That's such a good example. I did not know that one. And shout out to ChatGPT for being confidently wrong enough that you looked it up to confirm that. In fact, a friend of mine gives tours at the American Museum of Natural History here in New York City, and she once was like double checking some of the facts. It was like a bug exhibit. Before she went on the tour, she was like new to the particular wing of the. Anyway, she was asking ChatGPT something, and it said, like bugs, humans also have exoskeletons. And she was just like, what? Like it's really sometimes very wrong. But the point of, something that is taken as cold, hard, capital T truth, Earth is the center of the universe is another good one. Those are all really good examples of the kind of humility that we need. Stop me if you know this one, but my favorite one, like what you described, is the tale of the inductive turkey. Do you know the tale of the inductive turkey?
No.
This is the children's book to traumatize the youth. So the inductive turkey. So inductive reasoning is what we're describing. It's like you observe something, and from all those observations, you draw a broader conclusion. The sun must rise on this side and set on that side, right? As opposed to deductive, which is you start with a theory and then look for evidence, like we talked about earlier. So the inductive turkey is a turkey that lives at a farm, and every day, every morning, the farmer comes out and opens the gate and hands the turkey food. And then the next day, the farmer comes out, opens the gate, hands the turkey food. Next day, so the turkey uses inductive reasoning to conclude, wow, the farmer is my friend. The farmer is going to bring me food every day. And that happens for 2 years until, lo and behold, the farmer comes out, opens the gate, and kills the turkey. And you're like, it's true until it's not,
This is really a children's book?
It's not.
Oh.
I'm working on, no, it's not a children's book. It's a book that I traumatize my students with. It's not a book at all. It's a story.
Okay.
In a random social science book that I read once. But that's, but you say that, right? And I can say that to smart, thoughtful, science-minded people like you. And it's like, yes, of course, we need to have that kind of humility and know that the next study could show everything's wrong. But again, the problem is that you put that language in front of, let's call them bad actors, or people who are not truly trying to understand the world, but are trying to push an agenda, and you can tell whatever story you want, which is why we see headlines like every other day. They're like, coffee cures cancer. Coffee causes heart disease. Coffee's going to kill you. Coffee's going to make your life better. Because every single study is a teeny tiny bit different, and they're focusing, is it the caffeine? Is it the whatever coffee's made of? Is it something else? You're going to get all this noise, and over time you kind of get a clear picture. But as you said, the minute you go out to outer space, you might say, oh, look, we've been looking at the moons all wrong. So we just have to always be open to that possibility.
Yeah, one of the things, Dr. Marianne Gary has been on the show a bunch of times, and people are big fans of her. And one of the things she said to me was, on one of the episodes, was when you hear about a study, ask yourself one question, compared to what? So when they tell you the Mediterranean diet is going to make you have low cholesterol and you're going to be thin and you're going to be beautiful and have long dark hair, but you got to look at compared to what. So what are those comparisons every time? And is that part of what you have to do when you're trying to draw correlations or causations from big data or small data?
Right. So that is exactly, that's a great question to ask is, compared to what? What is in this case, we're looking for something that would be akin to the control group, right? So is it someone who isn't eating a Mediterranean diet? Well, then we would want to know, well, what kind of diet are they eating, and all of that. My advice is, anytime I see a study, and I really encourage this to be for everyone, you don't need science training to do it, is anytime, you're reading the New York Times, you see something on Instagram that's like a cool scientific study, go to the study itself. Yes, there's a lot of jargon. Science is, broadly speaking, getting better. As you move to the social sciences, there's less jargon because we all know what voters are in a way that we might not all know what mitochondria are or whatever, right? So there's a little bit less jargon. But it's worth, even if you don't fully understand all the jargon and a lot's behind a paywall, no good. But even looking at the abstract helps you get a sense of like, so I could see two headlines. One, coffee kills you. One, coffee makes you live forever, right? Mediterranean diet makes you live forever. One, the Mediterranean diet is terrible, whatever. Go to the study itself, and the study itself is going to be something very, 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 very small and specific. A good study, kind of unfortunately needs to be very small and specific. One of my dissertation advisors used to always describe it as like an hourglass, like your big question, is coffee bad for you? is the Mediterranean diet going to save your life? Is it interesting? And then the headlines are even broader than that because they want people to click, and it's clickbait. But the actual study itself is going to be like, well, we had 12 men and 12 women take a Mediterranean diet cooking class, and then a month later we tested their blood pressure. You're like, what? Like, and maybe that's informative. And some of the studies many studies are better than that. That's why I'm not in health sciences. But that's often what we're working with. You're like, oh, I see. The study has necessarily, to do this randomized controlled or approximate that as close as we can, you really do have to be so very specific and say, okay, what we mean by this is they just added olive oil instead of Crisco to their cookie. I don't know,
and it was funded by the Olive Growers Association of Italy.
Well, that's the other thing you want to look for is who's funding these things. So I have a podcast as well, not to bring that up, but you and I had emailed about an interview I did with someone named Christy Ashwanden, who is a science journalist and an athlete. And she talks about similar sorts of things where there's a ton of research in sports science about how to make sure that you're sufficiently hydrated and worrying about being dehydrated. And it turns out there's a whole field of hydration science. And there's all this research about like, you want this amount of salt and this amount of potassium and these electrolytes and this amount, da, 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 da. And it turns out the field of hydration science was invented by a company that provides sports drinks. Like, it's just, you do need to have, again, you have to have that skeptic's hat on when you look at all of these things. So when you look at any data, so one of the other things I encourage people to do, as you've seen in my videos and in my life, is don't be shy about finding data in the world and downloading it and mucking around with it. I think that, this is changing in some fields, but I think all research should be open source and data should be available to the extent that it's ethically possible. It's not always if it's sensitive, like health information. But if you can download the data and just start looking at it, even with a simple scatter plot, the first thing you do, you're in Excel or whatever, you have your scatter plot, you say, wow, there's a positive correlation between long, beautiful hair and the Mediterranean diet or whatever data it is that you've downloaded. The first thing you want to ask yourself is, what are the plausible stories I could tell that would give rise to this picture? And there's almost always going to be more than one. If anything, there's probably going to be dozens. And then your next question is, okay, how do I distinguish between these different possible stories? Are these correlations completely spurious? Is it the case that there is some causation? If so, what's causing that causation? And then you go and find data on that thing, and you kind of keep drilling down as best you can. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yes, it does. Yeah. And I want to circle back to Christy, but I want to point to this exactly. Yeah. I discovered that the Department of Energy has, you can download massive amounts of data on electric vehicles, on charging stations, and, is it light trucks or what, just all kinds of great data that you can download, and you pick and choose little columns. And one of the things I want to look at is how many more charging stations are there than there were a year ago. And so I downloaded October 2023, October 2024, and I did, you love pivot tables, right?
I love it.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So pivot table, I knew we would bond on that one.
Yes.
So I did pivot tables
bringing people
on
together since they were invented.
And I was able to see that there was this massive increase. It was like, I don't know, 34% or something. And I did it by company, how much they had each increased and everything. And then I was on Bodie Grimm's podcast, the Kilowatt podcast, all about electric vehicles. And I was talking to him about it, and we were going through it, and he had gone through it as well. And I said, well, this was really cool because I could see that I think it was the Inflation Reduction Act that put in money for new charging stations. And this is great to see the evidence that this actually happened. He says, yeah, Allison, there hasn't been enough time for anybody to build a station with that money yet.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Yeah. But that's exactly the kind of reasoning you want to go through. You did it exactly right. And one of the other things you did that's great that too few of us do is, well, A, downloading the data and mucking around with it. You were already a teacher's pet. Now you're a teacher's favorite pet, right? That's amazing. But then it's exactly that. It's looking through it and then sharing your findings.
Peer review.
With others. Peer review. And particularly people who know the area that you're talking about better, right? And then they can say, nah, it's probably not that. And now that you know, you can keep digging and say, well, what is it that caused this thing to go up? Or what are the likely candidate stories? And which one seems the most plausible? And you keep going from there. Often the best you can do is most plausible. And that's kind of the
You also talk about, and this is a really important thing in science, is that a valid scientific theory is one that can be proven wrong.
Correct.
Can you talk about that a little bit? Why is that important?
Yeah, so you can never prove a theory right. And that's something that I say to my students every day and still don't always get through. And it feels counterintuitive, but basically, you can prove like in math, there are proofs, right? And you can say because of this, and then we're done. But otherwise, just like the inductive turkey, just like the observations on Mars, you can't prove a theory correct because you never know if the next observation you see is going to be one that refutes the entire thing. So the best you can do is fail to disprove your theory. And that is so clunky. It's so kind of pessimistic too. It's like, oh, I failed to disprove my theory. You're like, just own it. You had a win, but you didn't. You just failed to disprove. So what you're doing, ideally, as a scientist, is you're saying, I have a theory. I think that the Inflation Reduction Act caused electric vehicle construction to increase. I need to look for evidence that if I'm right, how would that show up in the data? Well, in this case, it would have to be that the construction happens at a time frame long enough out from the act. You didn't find evidence of that, or you don't have evidence yet. So in this case, you're disproving your theory. If you did find it, you say, okay, I failed to disprove my theory. Maybe this is 2 years from now and electric vehicle growth still continues. And you say, wow, it is plausible in this case that the Inflation Reduction Act did do something in the second year to cause increase, and maybe the increase was even higher than the first year. Okay, so you haven't proved your theory. You've simply failed to disprove it.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I first heard of this when my husband Steve does a lot of research into physics. He loves physics and watches a lot of stuff and everything. And he was talking to me about string theory. And he said one of the problems with string theory was it is not possible to prove it wrong. Right. And if you can't prove it, if there isn't a way to prove it wrong,
right,
it just doesn't count. You don't get to do that. You can't really depend on that one if there's no way to prove it wrong.
It is part of I would say the strength and kind of the like less fun part of science is like you're kind of limited in your theories to things that you could test. And it keeps us from being like, I think it's 6 octopus gods that are running everything because I can't prove that it is or that it isn't. And so it's sort of not helpful, right? Yeah. Religion sort of lives in its own separate place and I'll set that aside. But as far as science is concerned, yeah, you do have to limit yourself to like, I think it's the case that this is happening because of this. There must be some way to prove you wrong. Otherwise, you're not doing science. And that's sort of what, when you get into like flat earthers and things like that, there's sort of like, and conspiracy theories get very difficult because often the evidence of a conspiracy theory, it is the lack of evidence. Yeah. And so you can't prove it wrong, right? You're just like, there's no evidence that it wasn't. You're like, oh, shit. But but the one leeway is you don't necessarily have to, you want a theory that you can test outright. Often what you're working with in political science, for example, we often are working with theories that you can't possibly fully test the implications of. So there's a theory in political science and international relations called audience costs, which is that the theory goes that sometimes leaders do things because they don't want their constituents to be mad at them, even if it's not the best thing for the country. So if I say, hypothetically, I'm going to invade you, scary dictator, if you don't back down, the scary dictator doesn't back down, I would prefer as a leader to not start a war because I've publicly said all this stuff and because I have an election around the corner. Now I have incurred these audience costs that are going to force me to then have to follow through on, it's kind of like a commitment device to follow through on what I said. People have applied that to Bush in the Iraq War and some other things. You can't really test all of that in a single study or even decades of studies, but you can get at little pieces of it. So if that's true, then we should see more wars or more invasions initiated by leaders that have publicly declared their intent to invade. Okay, but we still haven't proven our theory because it could be that leaders are declaring their intent to invade because they're going to invade. It has nothing to do with audience costs. And then we say, well, what about the audience costs? Now we need evidence from a polling outfit that shows that people really cared about the leader following through on what they said. That we say, okay. And then there's experimental research, like true experiments, where we say, okay, I'm going to put half of people in one room and half of people in the other room, and one half is going to read a bunch of articles about a leader that drummed up energy for a war and then backed down, and then another that drummed up energy for a war and then invaded, and see if which side prefers the leader. And it turns out so you can get at pieces of it. So you don't have to be able to test the whole grand theory, because no theory can be fully tested. And the other piece is, think Einstein's theory of relativity. If you can articulate what a test would look like, even if you don't have the technological capacity to run it,
Right.
That can count. We didn't
Yeah.
know, we weren't able to test implications of Einstein's theory until I think after he died in some cases.
Right.
And so I don't know enough about string theory to say how much falls under one
how about the
category
Higgs
or the
boson?
other.
I mean,
Yeah, exactly.
Higgs got to live until it was proven, right?
Yeah.
But we knew that it was possible to disprove it.
Right.
There was a test. Right. I want to circle back to your podcast. So your podcast is called Behind the Data at behindthedata.show.com. And it's fantastic because I'm teacher's pet. I'm going to admit I'm still a little bruised on the whole political thing. So I haven't listened to the last two that are about political stuff. But when you were talking to, is it Christy or Chrissy?
Christine.
And Christine. So she was talking about the hydration studies, but I loved when she just sort of obliquely mentioned using like fitness trackers to sleep to track sleep. And I sent you my article that I because I do like clickbait that I entitled "Sleep Tracking is Stupid." And I've had a lot of fun response to that because, of course, I was poking everybody who loves sleep tracking. My theory, which I have not tried to disprove, is that people just like data about themselves. Yeah. That's all it is. Right. It's like if we had a way to every day measure the size of our ears, I think you could sell an app that does that and get a whole group of people excited about it.
Now that's a study. So that's kind of like what we would call a field experiment where develop that thing, see if you can sell it. And if you can, we won't prove anything, but we'll fail to disprove that people will buy any data, any device that tracks data about themselves. And you can make up some science sounding things about how like it's correlated with longevity, some garbage, right? It doesn't have to be true. You can just
sleeping
say whatever you
on
want
your left
marketing.
side or something like that. In fact, if you wear the Aura ring and track the size of your left ear, that would be really good.
Right.
But the thing that I poke at with this sort of tracking of yourself is that if there's no actionable information taken from it, then it's simply, That's all. That's interesting. Like I already woke up exhausted. Knowing I woke up 17 times didn't actually help me not wake up 17 times.
Exactly, and it might even make you feel worse because now you know that you didn't sleep well, even though you know something about seeing it. It's so. For example, I was very, very sick in Macedonia once a long time ago, and they record temperatures in Celsius. And as a true American patriot, I don't know what Celsius means. I like think about data all the time. I cannot get my head around Celsius. So I'm in bed. They're taking my temperature. They're saying, "Wow, your temperature is 40. Your temperature is 40." And I'm like, "Okay, whatever." And then finally on day 3, I drag myself out of bed and because this is pre-cell phones, Google what is 40 degrees in Fahrenheit, and it's like a lot. It's like way over 100. And I was like, "Oh my God, I'm sick."
I'm way sicker now.
And then I felt really sick. Yeah. What's that?
Yeah, you're way sicker now that you know.
Yeah, you can really, it's like when a kid falls, they don't start crying until they look up and see their parents' horrified faces. Like and Christy makes a similar point to you, which is like, we have built-in devices in our bodies to sense if we're tired or we're thirsty or we need a nap or we slept well, and maybe start to go on that because I think your summary of it is exactly right. It's like you're just kind of like, okay, and you're just like. But then you feel like you want more information. You're like, well, why was I waking up and where was I going? And like, maybe if you could start to do that. And, of course I wouldn't, begrudge anyone who really felt like they needed to go into like a sleep study or a sleep apnea or whatever.
100%.
But most of us don't need this data. It's very silly. Yeah.
There was Jill from the North Woods actually wrote another article for my website entitled "Sleep Tracking Isn't Stupid," because she happened to discover she was waking up at like 2:13 every single day. Why 2:13? So she set an alarm for 2:00 and she waited till 2:13, and it turned out like the heater was turning on, or there was some device near her bedroom that was turning on, and she changed the timing of it so it would stop waking her up. Okay, there's one.
There's one. I mean, it's one of those too where it's like the real answer is somewhere in the middle. And I would say closer to and I agree with you on the stupid side of things, like to our stance on it, where it's like, yes, there are cases where this information is helpful, but those cases are rare. So think of it kind of like driving a car. Like there's only so many pieces of information on the dashboard. If there was a bunch of other information, I don't know enough about cars to say, but a bunch of other information that you didn't really need unless something was very, very wrong, you would just look at it and fixate on it and start freaking out for no
Right.
reason, when really you don't need to start paying attention to that until you notice this other thing, the temperature has gone up. My friend of mine, Steve Novella, who's a medical doctor who was also on the
Oh, he
podcast,
was
talked about it.
fantastic. Oh,
Isn't he
he's
great?
so good.
Oh, he's so good. His show, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, is all about the kind of critical reasoning that we've been talking about this whole time. So if any of your listeners are interested, I highly recommend Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. He talked about the same thing, unprompted by me, in medicine, where it was something, I'm going to get this wrong, but the idea was that doctors for a long time, when they were delivering babies, would track the fetal heartbeat and the fetal heart rate. And because that was the idea was, well, a beating heart is a sign of health. So why not keep track of that during birth? And maybe that can help improve outcomes. And they were doing it. And it turns out something like whenever the mother pushes, the heart rate stops because of just how it slows down something, right?
Something.
Because of just how the body is working and what's happening to everyone in this crazy situation. And that caused doctors to freak out. And they did a lot more emergency C-sections than they should have for some number of years before everyone figured out, oh, this is why we're doing this. So it's actually better if we just don't have that data. And that didn't improve health. It turned out to be superfluous data. And so you could argue that it's good they went through that and now they know. So we can all track our sleep for a year or two, figure out the one or two interesting things, and then let it go. Until I'm really feeling generally horrible, I have deleted all sleep tracking from the example that I come across a lot. I do a lot of consulting in like corporate, nonprofit, organizational world where they're very interested in, we have all this data on our employees, on new hires, on people we want to hire, clients, customers. How can we optimize whatever relative to them? And you're like, well, it gets shady. But basically all of them want dashboards. They're like, we want dashboards about all our people, and we want dashboards about all our customers. And you're like, I promise you, you don't want dashboards. Like just sitting and staring at a whole bunch of numbers, you're like, okay, like unless you know what you're looking for or what you said, what your action will be as a result of this data, it's not worth tracking that data. It really isn't.
The example I like to give on that is, and I got this from a metrics class I took at work where the guy said, if you want to lose weight, the thing you don't want to do is weigh yourself.
Exactly.
Because weighing yourself, it's just like sleep tracking. It is the result. What you want to do is you want to measure how many calories are you burning and how many calories are you consuming. And then you track your progress with weighing yourself. And I remember telling the guy, I said, yeah, I think you're onto something, because I tried weighing myself twice a day and I still didn't lose weight,
Yeah.
It had no connection to it at all, but it's the exact same thing. And until they have sleep tracking apps where it somehow automatically knows that I had 3 glasses of bourbon right before I went to sleep, or I played video games right till 5 minutes before I tried to go to sleep, until it can measure those things, or you have a way to input it that's easy to do, I don't know that it's really gonna help people.
Right. I'm working on a current study right now, developed yesterday or the day before with a friend of mine. My friend Damien is a friend of mine. The other day he posted a bunch of stuff on Instagram on his stories that were really funny. And I messaged him and I was like, your stories are killing it today. It was like just super funny, weird stuff. And he's a funny guy. He's a comedian, whatever. I was like, you're killing it today. And he said, thanks. I'm completely exhausted. So maybe that has something to do with it. And I was like, maybe. And then we kind of went down a Nick Cage drowning.
Are we funnier when we're tired?
Yeah, exactly. And so he was like, well, I do have the sleep tracking app. So he was like, I'm going to send you a screenshot of my sleep health each day, and you're going to score my stories on a scale of 1 to 10 of how funny they are. So I am running a study currently, we're 2 days in, on hilarity of his Instagram stories as a result of no sleep. But that's another example of like, even if I did really do that study, and maybe I will, because as I talk about, I'm like, that actually would be really fun. So, but then it's like my subjective idea, but whatever.
Sure.
So I do the study. You would do a teeny tiny study that maybe I track him for a year. I subjectively apply these scores. He sends me his sleep data, whatever. He's only sleeping 6 hours a night. So obviously his stories are very funny. Damien Chadwick on Instagram, get involved. But it's like, I would release that study a year from now, and the headlines would read something like the secret to being funny, don't sleep ever again. Like it would go from this very specific, nuanced, narrow, possibly pointless, but maybe slightly interesting thing to something where it's like you have cults of only sleeping 2 hours a night in the name of
for comedians,
being the next great. Exactly. You could just completely blow it up. And so that's what happens with all of this stuff. It's like science is either taken as capital T truth, which it's not, or it's taken as a whole bunch of lies peddled to us by the government trying to get us vaccinated, which it's also not, right? I mean,
There's something in between.
There's something in between, yeah.
You bring up being funny, and I mean, it's obvious to me how data science and stand-up comedy and being a circus performer correlate. Why
perfect.
you would do all three. But maybe for people who haven't made that jump and aren't teachers' pet, can you explain how you do all three of those things?
Right. I would be happy to. I would love to hear what you think is the correlation between those three things, because my therapist and I can't figure it out. But I like to think that each one helps satisfy a different part of my brain. And I think this is probably true for many people, right? It's like you're stuck on a problem, like go for a long walk, or, I don't really do ball sports because I'm not coordinated enough for that. So some people play soccer. I just decided in grad school that I was going to be pursuing mental health by like hanging from stuff that was on the ceiling. And so to circus actually in grad school. I did dance growing up and always did that kind of movement stuff, but I got into circus in grad school truly as a coping device because, the main, I don't know how many of your listeners have gone through graduate school, but particularly PhD programs, the goal is to make you feel bad about yourself. I'm convinced that that's the goal. Okay. And boy, I succeeded. I felt so bad about myself that every Sunday I would go hang from random crap in a warehouse in Detroit. I went to University of Michigan, and that would like rehabilitate my self-esteem. So circus became this very like, it's playful, it's exploratory. There's no wrong answers. No one cares about your p-values in your study. Like, it was just lovely to go somewhere and talk to people who are not political scientists, as much as I love political scientists. And then comedy is sort of in between, kind of, to me, connects those worlds. So circus is, it's very disciplined and there's a lot of kind of physical pain, but it keeps you out of your head, right?
Okay, right.
Data science and teaching and talking about data science and doing data science is very heady. It's only your head.
Right.
Stand up and improv to an extent. I'm not so good at improv, but comedy is kind of in between. You're in your body. It's a live performance. You're doing things in the moment. You're reading the room, and you're on your feet. Literally, you're standing up, and it's totally your head as well, right? Because like, you think of your favorite comedians, they're absolutely brilliant. They're quick. They're sharp. They can think of things on the fly. The crowd work is dynamite. They notice things in the world. Oh, that's so true. Why didn't I ever think of that? That kind of stuff. So they have the minds of scientists, but like the bodies and like the room awareness of like a circus performer. I never thought of those in that connection before, but it brings together the performance and the thinking, I think, for me.
Here's something I think you're going to love. Alan Alda is, right?
Yeah.
Alan Alda has something called the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science. It's at Stony Brook University. And what he does is teach scientists to do stand-up, improv.
Does he? I didn't know that.
Yeah. And he does this because he says that if you can get good at improv, you can change the way you're trying to explain science to somebody and make a better impact because you're adapting to what they're doing instead of just being, I have these rote things I want to say. And it's a real odd thing. It's actually like a foundation sort of a thing. He has a really great podcast, which is, I'm blanking on the name of it, but I'll come up with it in a second. Anyway, all of the money that he earns from doing the podcast goes to the to Stony Brook University and to this program. So
I knew about the Alan Alda Institute, and I remember searching for it at various points when I was like, who's doing a really good job of communicating science? Oh, look at this whole institute. It's amazing. But I had no idea they were doing improv. I strongly believe that everyone should take an improv class. Obviously, classes are expensive and people have time constraints. But if you can, and you're looking for something new to do, or just like try something different in the new year, improv. I am not a good improviser. I moved to stand up because I always wanted to do stand up, but I was too afraid of being on stage by myself. And improv, you're on stage as a group, and you have playing games, or an audience gives you a suggestion, and you make a scene based on the suggestion. So it's interactive. And so I was like, this is gonna be safer. But on all the scenes, I would just stand there like with my arms crossed and like just speak my own point of view. And I was like, maybe I'm in the wrong discipline. But I did a ton of improv classes, and it made me way more comfortable on stage for stand-up. And most importantly, it is the one thing that helped me the most when I became a teacher for the first time. When I was in graduate school, they don't teach you how to teach. They teach you the material, and then you work as a TA or teacher assistant, but you're kind of just running discussions, and you're kind of just grading. You're not really teaching your own class. The first time I ever taught my very own class, I was a postdoc at Carnegie Mellon. It was a class of only like 12 or 13 students. It was this like weird upper level, like international relations, audience costs related media thing. I was so nervous. I was like, I have no business being a teacher. I cannot be in charge of this class. What am I going to say? And I remembered, I was like, oh, in improv, I would go on stage with no plan and entertain a room of audiences. I mean, I had other people with me, but like with no plan and like do a 60-minute show and you get through it. And I reminded myself of that as I would go into my classroom every day. And I was like, I have slides, I have a plan. Like, this is not as hard as improv. And that reminder and then that skill set is what allowed me to teach and not freak out more than I already did. So if you're looking to like ever just improve communication skills, presentation, whether you're a scientist or working at a company or whatever, I don't know. Have you done improv? It's the greatest.
I haven't, but that makes me think. It never occurred to me to try that.
You've got to.
I do enjoy making people laugh. That's for sure.
Yeah. No, and it's playful and it's silly and it's so rare as adults that we get to be around other adults and just be like goofy. And you're not like goofy, like making faces and like silly. You're kind of like having scenes and you're exploring things and it's very, I think really good improv is as good or better than really good stand-up. The problem is the variation in improv is really, really high. Like bad improv is really hard to watch, whereas bad stand-up is sort of interesting in its own way sometimes. But it's just so. I'm talking myself into taking another improv class. It's just I've been trying to. My partner is not. He does not want to be in front of people. He does not want to be on stage. He does not want to be known. Yeah, but I was like, you've got to take improv just to get out of your own head a little bit.
Oh, Steve would. We were on a cruise one time with some friends, and they had a karaoke thing, and one of our friends got up and did karaoke. And Steve told me afterwards that to this day, he gets like cold sweats thinking of that. If he goes to hell, that is what he will be forced to do. That is the last thing in the world he would ever do. And I thought, man, that looks fun, Oh, it was Clear and Vivid.
Karaoke. I'm
Clear
with him on that.
Clear and Vivid is the name of the Alan Alda's podcast. He has a Clear and Vivid Science and then just regular Clear and Vivid, but they're both really science.
Okay. But
they're really good.
No, Clear and Vivid, that's a really good name. I'm sorry, I didn't think of that. That's really good.
He's got spectacular guests, and everybody he talks to is interesting. He has comedians, he has scientists, astronomers, just all the whole gamut. It's really, really fun.
Okay, cool.
The last thing I wanted to ask you about was on your website, jonesroy.com, and that's ROOY, just to make it harder to find.
Yes.
It says you're the founder of the data thinking revolution. What?
Correct.
What is that?
It's a great question. It turns out you can be a founder of anything if you just say so on the internet. So it's not, an LLC or an Inc. or anything. It's just a thing I'm thinking about. It's basically my shorthand working term for everything you and I have just been talking about, which is when people think about data science and analytics and predictions and all this kind of metrics and stuff, they tend to think about, of course, the numbers themselves, which are very important. And, what programming language should I learn? Like, should I learn Python? Should I learn R? Am I Tableau? We get hung up on the tools of it. Mm-hmm. And there's sort of an arms race in terms of like, well, I know Java and C++. And you're like, well, okay. And that's very valuable. And it's a huge part of how we're making really interesting discoveries. And there's a lot of interesting work, particularly with the computation and improving our abilities to make causal inference, like we were talking about earlier. But there's a whole other chunk of data science, which is basically thinking critically and thinking like a scientist and going through the exercise like we talked about with you and your theory about electric vehicles, which is like, oh, this is an interesting pattern. I wonder what it could mean. I wonder what could explain it. Here are a bunch of different narratives that could tell that story. How do I discern between those? How do I do future studies? What are the other things that could be going on besides causality in this core? All that stuff. And we haven't even talked about a lot of like, how is this measured? Where did this data come from? Is this data even picking up what we think it's picking up? All of that thinking that happens around making discoveries with data is what I'm calling for now the data thinking revolution. This is why I'm so upset that he thought of Clear and Vivid, because that's so good. I need something catchier, but that's what it is. It's basically trying to get people to, yeah, exactly. I just need Alan Alda's brain for the rest of my life. That's all I need.
I love it. Well, can I be part of the data thinking revolution?
You sure can. You are currently in charge of it because you've watched more of those videos than I have. I'm not sure I watched my own videos all the way through. So I think you're leading the revolution for sure.
Well, they're wonderful. The podcast Behind the Data at behindthedatashow.com. the YouTube series was everybody just go watch one, and I dare you to stop after one.
I'm so
I don't
excited.
think you'll be able to do it. This has been great fun. Is there any other way people can follow you, should follow you than what we've talked about?
I mean, those are the big ones. I'm ever so slightly on Instagram at Jones-Roy with 2 O's as well. But I recently went through a phase where I decided social media was bad for me. So I torched all my social media. So it looks like I've been on the internet for about 12 days. But I'm slowly I'll be putting some clips and stuff up, probably from the videos. So YouTube is probably the place to find those videos.
Okay, cool. Because I did look around for you on that. I'm sort of like a Mastodon girl, and so that's where I'm living over there with the nerds, and that's been fun over there.
How is it over there? Is it good?
It's nice. There's no algorithm, so you follow people, and then you see what they post, and you can follow hashtags, and you see what people post. And it's
the good old days.
lot less Nazis too, as it turns out.
Nice.
So I mean, if you want Nazis, there's actually
X
Nazi servers. There's Nazi servers, servers that allow Nazis, but it's a federated system. So if I've got let's say I've got a Christian server, I could defederate the Nazi server, and then nobody on my server will ever see that. But there's big servers where it's just, mostly everybody's okay, but please no Nazis, just
right.
Carve off the Nazis and then everything else is pretty much okay. But it's a whole lot less hate and less anger, and virtually every photo has alt tags on it for the blind.
So nice.
It's really weird. It's like it's a thing. Like you're kind of people won't upvote you if you didn't put an alt tag on your images.
Oh, I love it.
The descriptions.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
All right, you've persuaded me. I did the thing where I basically got rid of all the social media, but I didn't really put any back. So maybe that's where I'll start.
It's nerd heaven. A lot of science stuff.
It could be good.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Well,
Okay.
maybe.
All right.
Well, this has been so much fun. I'm so glad we're besties now.
Yes, we are. Yes, indeed. Thank you for watching everything and for the great conversation.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Chit Chat Across the Pond. Did you notice there weren't any ads in the show? That's because this show is not ad-supported. It's supported by you. If you learned something, or maybe you were just entertained, consider contributing to the Podfeet podcast. You can do that by going over to podfeet.com and look for the big red button that says Support the Show. When you click that button, you're going to find different ways to contribute. You can donate one time through the big Donate button with a credit card or Apple Pay, or you can use PayPal. If you want to make a recurring contribution, click the Patreon button. Keep in mind, I don't charge Patreon for Chit Chat Across the Pond or Programmed by Stealth episodes, just once a month for the NosillaCast. That keeps it simple. If you want to contact me for any reason, you can email me at allison@podfeet.com, and you can follow me on Mastodon at podfeet.com/Mastodon. If you want to talk to other NosillaCastaways, you can do that in our Slack group at podfeet.com/Slack. Thanks for listening, and stay subscribed.